it was choppy for me before initially.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing.
That's better.
That works for me.
Much better.
Didn't change anything. Maybe the network just cleared up.
I think there might be issues when there's people in the room that forget that their video turns on whenever a new person joins. So if someone joins with their video on, everybody in the room suddenly gets more video if they're using the full client, which is why it's better to not use the full client when you're in this room and to actually use the light client. But if you do use the full client, please be sure to regularly check that you're not taking a video stream in.
Okay, and so Richard, what did you say your plan was with Mohit? Because you hadn't communicated it to me, and I got all the materials ready. So I just
No, I should. Yeah, I
I'm in
mean,
the dark.
feel free to drive. Feel free to drive if you like. Mohit and I just talked in the back channel like just now. He had asked me to drive, but I'm also happy to have you drive since you did all the prep.
I'm happy to not drive. Nope, I did all the material creation, so I'm happy for one of you to drive if you'd like.
Happy
just
to.
be
Maybe I'll
aware,
get things
that's all.
started. Yep, we're deciding on the fly, so no problem. Not being aware. So I think we're at time. I'm going to try to proceed. Yeah, Kathleen, maybe you could drive through the beginning here while I fiddle with audio, because apparently I'm bad.
All right, so we are at time. So Paul and Peter Yee will take minutes using the tool. And it looks like, Paul, you're also driving slides. So here's the note well. Welcome to Secdispatch. If you're in the wrong place, go to the right place. Please note the note well, and then the Secdispatch process, the ground rules. So Secdispatch recommends next steps for new work, and it's really the ADs that can make that final decision along with the community. Secdispatch does not itself adopt drafts, and some of the possible outcomes include direct to an existing working group, propose a new focused working group, AD sponsorship if an AD is willing, additional discussion or community development required, or the IETF should not work on a particular topic. So next slide, please. All right, and so now agenda bashing. We have the agenda on 2 slides. So we will begin with what I thought would be the shorter drafts, the ones that will get through the quickest. So they may not take a full 15 minutes. I expect they'd be rather fast. So Cipher Suites, IANA SSH protocol parameters. And next slide, just for agenda bashing, thank you. Encrypted client hello deployment considerations. That one might be more discussion, and architecture for trustworthy and transparent digital supply chain. That could also be a bit more of a discussion, and then key consistency and discovery. Any agenda bashing? Okay, so we have Christopher Wood in the queue.
Yeah, Kathleen, as I said over email, this the last item was added to the agenda quite late, so I'm no longer able to do the presentation.
Okay. All right, thank you. All right, so if that's it, we will begin with the first presentation. Thanks, Paul. I'll go on mute. So we have a speaker in the room. Great.
Hello, this is Joe Salloway. I'm presenting this draft on updating the Cipher Suites in Secure Syslog, along with Chris Lonvik and Sean Turner. Next slide, please. Okay, it turns out that IEC working group wants to refer to Syslog, Secure Syslog, but unfortunately the draft is pinned to TLS 1.2 and the mandatory to implement algorithm at that time, which is TLS RSA with AES 128 CDC SHA. This algorithm is now deprecated, And so we want to fix this problem. So let's go to the next slide. What can we do? We don't necessarily have to do anything. The IEC working group can update their documentation to reference the new updated algorithms. But it probably would be better if we maintained the RFC and updated the syslog, TLS and DTLS algorithm guidance in our documents. Next slide. So what changes have we made in these drafts? First thing was just to kind of justify why we made that change. Updated the mandatory to implement to TLS ECDHE RSA with AES 128 GSM SHA 256, which is generally accepted as a good one. You also said that you're allowed to use TLS or DTLS 1.3. We also will need to add some recommendations on how to handle zero RTT in these cases. And then we'll have a section that discusses the changes. Next slide. Okay, so how should we take care of this draft? We can bring it to an existing working group, have a BOF, AD sponsor, independent submission.
Roman, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for bringing this to us, Joe. To bring everyone kind of up to speed on other coordination we've been doing, welcome kind of all the feedback we're going to get at the mic line here. We did check with the ops area to see whether there's any existing kind of work that's really close to this with syslog. They said no, but they did point out that ops WAG would potentially accept this. So that's an option. Thank you.
Eric?
So I think not BOF is too small, not ISE. It's actually a thing we care about. Not AD sponsor is too big. So I think that probably his existing working group. Ops WG sounds okay. I was going to suggest UTA, but I think either of those would be okay. I don't think this is quite as trivial. I mean, this looks approximately right, but I think probably there'd be some little bit of messing around. So like probably having it like farmed down to working group would be useful. But I think either Utah or Rob would be fine.
Okay.
So any other feedback? I heard dispatching it to TLS or UTA. Perhaps AD sponsorship is possible by the ops ADs, but any other feedback from those in the room or in Meet Echo? Rick?
Okay, it sounds like then we'll discuss with the relevant ADs.
Hold on, Joe. There's still Rich.
Hey, Rich.
Yeah, just going to confirm. I think UTA is fine. I mean, from this, syslog's an application, right? And this is using TLS in an application, so that's all.
Okay.
Richard, did you have something?
No, I was just going to help sum up. It sounds like UTA is kind of where we're headed with this.
Excellent. I guess then we have dispatched this tentatively to UTA.
Else find that the slides look really goofy and are cut off?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. That should say update to the IANA SSH protocol parameters registry requirements. Next slide, please.
This is Meet Echo, sharing via Meet Echo. Do you want Peter for me to share the slides from my machine instead?
Yeah, that would probably make it a little easier for everybody else to read.
Just hold on. I'll download your slides locally and show them. 1 sec. Do you see the slides now, or?
Also seeing the interface and the slide is cut off. Just the title is
Looked better a minute ago, Mohit. Yep,
How
there
about
you
now?
go.
Excellent. So just let me know, Peter, when to go on the next slide.
Yeah, go ahead to the next slide, please. All right, so this draft is fairly straightforward. It updates the IANA Secure Shell Protocol Parameter Registry. Right now, most of it is IETF review as the requirement. This draft would change that to expert review. And like many other drafts of this type, it establishes an expert reviewers mailing list and gives some guidance around the expert reviewers. It does not change anything that actually requires a standard to be placed into the registry. So this is just a bunch of minor numbers, if you will. Next slide, please. This came up on the Curdle mailing list a bit over a year ago. And given the state of Curdle and no other perhaps obvious place to send it, I'm requesting security AD sponsorship, but obviously I would welcome other suggestions. That's pretty much it. The next slide just gives you a pointer to the mailing list entry.
So doesn't seem to, Roman, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I wanted to jump in here. We've talked about it internally, kind of with the Sec ADs. AD sponsorship really is the only way to go, given that we no longer have kind of Curdle. So we'll talk amongst ourselves to figure out who will take it, but we'll commit to AD sponsorship.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And it seems like there's support for that in the chat as well. So we'll consider that the outcome. Next.
Who is up next? Is it client hello or?
Yes, client hello.
Excellent.
Hi, everyone. So this is a proposal to basically sort of look at the ECH encrypted client hello standard that's developing the extension to TLS, and really just give some insight in terms of the potential impact on end users specifically, which as far as we can tell is new input into that particular discussion. I believe Paul Vixie is also attending the meeting, one of my co-authors, remotely, so he'll potentially sort of join in the discussion as well. Our third co-author, David Wright, isn't with us either in person or remotely, but by way of his background, he works in the education sector, and sort of, looking at some of the sort of security and privacy issues specific to schools in the sector. Next slide, please. So what we've done is to gather input from a variety, multiple stakeholders, interestingly. So lots of stakeholders to really get an understanding of where and how they see ECH impacting, specifically in terms of loss of visibility of the SNI data, which clearly is one of the intended consequences of encrypting it. Our view is that by having a sort of a better understanding of those impacts, that will hopefully lead to better solutions as the standard is developed. Hopefully that will work with minimal disruption to end users wherever possible, or at least if it's necessary to encourage sort of multi-stakeholder engagement so that there's awareness before the ECH is launched, as well as knowledge of the likely impacts on those sort of different user groups. Next slide, please. And I should say, just responding to a comment in the Secdispatch mailing list, in case it wasn't clear, the intent of the paper is not to stop deployment of ECH, but to provide better understanding in how and when it's deployed. So if that wasn't clear in the current draft, apologies. It's also worth just bearing in mind it is an initial draft, and we certainly will welcome additional input from anyone. We have already sort of requested stats from a number of interested parties that can potentially provide some additional sort of data input to give some quantitative insight to guide the admittedly pretty qualitative content so far. Just some other observations, just to call those out. RFC 7258 does highlight the need to protect sort of users' privacy, but sort of also notes that it's not acceptable in doing that to make networks unmanageable, and that's something which we think needs to be borne in mind. Also, RFC 8404 sort of covers sort of current security and network operations, as well as management practices. And you see, I've put the quote from that RFC, which really highlights that for enterprises in particular, where they're managing the data that traverses their networks, so these are private networks as opposed to public networks, they really do have an expectation quite so often of being able to sort of specifically directly manage what traffic is allowed to traverse those networks. And it's quite different an expectation to what might be expected on a typical public network. And then final comment on this slide, which I think is just worth unpacking, which is for on-path security actors, some of the data encapsulated by ECH is of legitimate interest to them, and loss of access to that data, which I'll come back to later, will potentially weaken the privacy of users on those networks. So if you like, this is where we get into a bit of a quandary, where by trying to protect privacy, we might actually weaken privacy if we don't deploy things with an understanding of the environments that we're deploying them into. And also, again, depending on context, again, for some networks, such as a home network or indeed a school network, issues like content filtering are entirely appropriate sort of considerations for the network owner and operator. And in some countries, actually, say in a school environment, which again I'll come on to, the school is required to operate content filtering. So any protocols that defeat that are actually making it hard for the network operator to meet their regulatory requirements. And that's clearly an issue. Next slide, please. So one of the sort of key RSCs, RSC 8744, sort of basically looked at some of the sort of considerations relating to encrypted SNI. It does, within the text, include a fairly brief description of what's characterized as unanticipated uses of SNI information in section 2.1, and a very brief 2-paragraph assessment of alternative options for those usages in the event that the SNI data is in fact encrypted. And if you like, there's a suggestion that most of those unanticipated usages can in fact be delivered through other means, although that's not really sort of fully covered in the actual text. And importantly, in this context, what it doesn't do is to take into consideration issues like the cost of those alternative solutions, i.e. the financial cost, or the operational complexity of those solutions, or indeed the technical capability of the parties that might be expected to move to those alternative solutions, or also the privacy implications for end users that might also be involved in that move. Because, for example, if you end up having to do deep packet inspection of all traffic, that isn't necessarily a good privacy outcome for the affected users, if it's a consequence of something which is intended to actually enhance rather than weaken their privacy. Next slide, please. So briefly, we've considered in the paper sort of impact on a couple of different types of users. Firstly, schools, and we've called out specifically in the US and the UK, schools are required to operate content filtering. In the UK, they're required in a sort of blanket way, so all schools are required to do so. In the US, they're required to if they want to qualify for a particular type of federal funding, which I think I give a reference to in the current draft. And in many instances, they use SNI data in order to help them with that filtering. One of the issues here is they move to what will typically look more like an enterprise grade solution as an alternative. There's potentially quite a considerable expense involved in doing that. And also, I know from first-hand experience that the technical capabilities of the support people in schools are nowhere near those of technical people in enterprise environments. So it will be potentially beyond the capabilities to implement effectively and reliably, which we believe is important consideration. So then you get to some of the alternative options for them. Well, if it's available, disabling ECH in client software will potentially be helpful. But I do know that some of the current sort of client software developers are not intending that it will be an option that can be disabled. So the only other alternative for them is to remove that software, which is potentially extremely disruptive and very expensive if they've got a long-term usage of such software and have to move to a completely different platform. And also, certainly in the school environment, potentially just moving completely away from bring your own device as an option. Again, because it becomes just too difficult to administer in that environment. And again, that is potentially also disruptive. Briefly, in the enterprise environment, again, SNI in many installations aids content filtering, including blocking access to malicious content. by phishing, etc., and also in some industries is an important part of their compliance obligations. And clearly for any enterprise, not meeting their compliance obligations is not up for discussion because the cost implications for that will be quite significant. So they will have to find a way to be compliant. And if S&I makes that harder, that's going to be an issue for them. You'll see also BYOD is potentially again an issue in some corporate environments. And certainly weakening cyber defenses is a concern, which I'll come on to, I think, on the next slide. And of course, not all enterprises are equal. The sort of resources, be it financial and operational, in a large enterprise are very different to those available in a small enterprise. So we shouldn't just assume that cost is not a consideration in the enterprise space. It absolutely is in many different sectors. Next slide, please. And then just looking at the threat detection point, RFC 8404 sort of highlights some of the issues arising from increased encryption of data generally, and a number of those points certainly apply here, and I don't believe have been considered fully yet. And perhaps more directly relevantly, there's a current draft indicators of compromise, which talks about, unsurprisingly, indicators of compromise, and highlights some of the issues there where you start to sort of compromise current defenses. And S&I data is absolutely one of those indicators of compromise, which is currently fairly widely used. So potentially, therefore, encryption of S&I data absolutely poses new challenges on threat detection specifically, and these don't appear to have been considered either in RFC 8744 or the current ECH draft. We certainly think that draft ought to include this issue in its security consideration section, which is currently more inward-looking rather than focused on this particular aspect of security. Next slide, please. Since the diagram often helps to sort of just convey the general point, in effect, what we're trying to really get across here, you look at the top diagram, the desired effect of the ECH development is to ensure that communication from a sort of user to their target takes place without observation or indeed interference. So that's the intent behind this quite clearly. The potential actual effect, though, of this, if more thought isn't applied, is actually it might prevent some of the defenses from kicking in, so they'll be unable to see what's happening, and in reality, it's going to aid communication with malicious content, surveillance by client software. Access to age-inappropriate content, for example, in a school or home environment, and on some networks, access to CSAM. So, if you like, the actual effect is potentially the exact opposite of the desired effect. And it's worth just throwing in at this point that when we start to think about specific special use cases, certainly for dissidents, there are better tools available to avoid being observed or their communication interfered with. Tor springs to mind. I think Kathleen on the Secdispatch list today pointed out, I think, the Brave browser, etc. Tools like ECH don't apply here because I think already about 2 years ago, the Great Firewall of China began blocking TLS 1.3 and encrypted S&I anyway. So they're just blocking it completely. So it's not really applicable in that context. There are, as I say, other better tools for that purpose. I think the last slide, please. So just in conclusion, we believe that the paper highlights some new end user harms which are valid, or potential harms which are valid, and that haven't yet been fully investigated, and we'd like to investigate those further. And as I've just outlined, SNI encryption does pose new challenges for threat detection, which by definition risks harming end user security. And to just quote a section from RFC 8890, it's not good practice to either avoid identifying harms, or when they have been identified, it's not acceptable to ignore them when they're raised. So that's why we believe this is something which needs to be dispatched somewhere, but we'll welcome sort of views on where that might be, and also any questions that people might have. Thank you. So Brendan?
I'd just like to point out that this is a very interesting dichotomy, because we have an entire working group designed explicitly to avoid this kind of inspection. It's called MASK. And on top of that, I'd like to point out that anytime your security depends on inspecting an encrypted link you've lost before you've started. I mean, if you want to do this kind of monitoring, it needs to be done on the end node. It's the only realistic answer.
Okay, thanks, Brendan. Stephen?
Hi, Stephen Farrell. So I guess I'm in the unfortunate position of only having to be able to discuss what this isn't. I think it isn't new. I think these considerations were raised previously. It isn't deployment considerations, because it's basically saying ECH is bad. Deployment considerations would be how you do it, or maybe how you do it better. And that's not this document. I don't think it is useful, really, to be honest. And I don't think it's something that we should work on. So it isn't something we should work on. I think it's the dispatch answer.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Tommy?
Hello, Tommy Polley from Apple. So I have a couple of points, hopefully to help with the dispatching here. So first, as discussed on the list, all the references to the for the users RFC are in conflict with the meaning of that RFC. I think Mark did a really good job of explaining that clearly. So to that end, I think this form of the document is not a good foundation to progress. Now, if we want to have discussions around ECH specifically, I think that belongs as comments to the TLS working group. As brought up, 8744 already talks about this area. If the community really thinks that needs revising, you could imagine a BIS document, but I don't expect that to happen. But I do think that there is a more useful way that we can talk about manageability and providing better signals. And that solution shouldn't be to prevent encryption or ESNI, which is trying to enforce more intentional sharing of data. But instead, we should be working on filling in the gaps for where intentional sharing of data to trusted parties to gain access to a network or other things, where that should happen. So the IAB is currently working on a draft that calls for more engineering work on new mechanisms for signaling that is intentional and trusted, to replace the use of implicit signals like the SNI that were silently being used for management, but were not intended for management. So this is draft IAB path signals collaboration. And so you can take a look at that. That can be discussed in architecture discussed, but it's essentially calling for the need for more work in the IETF on this. That would be a useful proposal to have. And then one last note, for the content filtering for school devices, there are already a lot better tools for on-device filtering software and parental controls that happen on the endpoint. And that's how these BYOD solutions ideally should work. And the SNI is a much less effective tool for managing those even today.
Okay, thanks, Tommy. Your sound was a bit choppy, but I think we got most of that. Ted?
Ted Hardy speaking. First, I'll join Tommy in saying I encourage people to look at the path signals draft. I'm one of the other co-authors of it. I actually don't think we had considered SNI as an explicit path signal, but certainly if you're going to send it as an explicit path signal, it would be a fascinating experiment to make. On the basic thing of this draft, I think functionally you're trying to ask the community to reconsider the consensus that 8744 represents. I think that means from a dispatch perspective, it has to go back to the working group that produced 8744, which is TLS. I think TLS will consider it very quickly indeed. But I think that's probably right, because I think that your characterization of this as not considered or not considered significantly by 8744 doesn't actually represent the discussion. It may represent the text in the actual RFC, but it was considered quite extensively in the production of 8744. And the characterizations in that document, I think, show a consensus that there is no way to tell the difference between an on-path attacker and an on-path manager in the network situation you're trying to describe, where you have no control over the end devices and only control of the network. If you go back a slide to your two pictures of desired effect, there's really no difference from the point of view of the external observer between the check mark and your guy in the hat. I can't tell what color his hat is, and I have no way of stopping him from dressing up as a check mark. So I think this has to go back to TLS, and I expect you will find there that they believe that they have already considered it appropriately. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I have to say, I know there were 1,000 or so messages in the mailing list at around the time of that document. They seem to be more focused on the technical detail of the protocol rather than the actual end users, but that's a discussion that can certainly be had. Kathleen?
So I'm not going to argue for this solution in particular. However, there is a real problem. So as CTO for Center for Internet Security, we support all of the US state, local, tribal, and territorial organizations. That includes schools, but it also includes all your local governments, fire departments, police departments, basically everybody that's under-resourced. And so to do something at scale, doing the endpoint is just very, very difficult. Right now, we're using DNS-based solutions to help with screening with those types of organizations. So we're not using SNI. But the problem is real because schools are getting hit with ransomware. All these organizations get hit with ransomware. They get shut down. Critical services, including hospitals. So that it's also in the SLTT bucket. So there is a problem to be solved. I'm not sure how we're going to solve it because with DOE, there's, and endpoints that aren't connected to whatever the screening service is, could be hit by malware and ransomware. So we have a real problem. We can't just expect to use safe browsing and get beyond it and to manage it at that scale, right? So there's a scale problem because these organizations use high school students in some cases to manage their security because that's all they have. So I really wanted to emphasize the problem here and that it's a big one. I'm not saying to solve it with SNI though.
Yeah.
But hopefully someone's inspired.
Yeah, and certainly, Kathleen, that's my experience of schools as well, and equally many small businesses that, yeah, the more complex we make stuff, the harder it is for them to actually have any effective security. And that's something we need to think about.
It's me, I'm marked as offline because I closed my laptop when I walked up. David Skenazy, Google. I'm going to make a comment with regards to dispatching, but first, I think Kathleen did a really good job of explaining the problem, is that there are networks today that don't have many resources and have to do something to protect users. And I'm sympathetic to that. I do understand. But I would like to ask a clarifying question, is in what way does this draft or the RFC that it could produce help solve this problem?
Given that this is an early draft, I think the intent is to start to scope out what the problem is in an expectation as it develops, we get towards a solution.
In your best case scenario of all the stars aligning and everything being perfect, what would be the ideal outcome at the IETF?
Well, as a minimum, that more consideration is given to these types of users, because at the moment the voice of the user is quite hard to detect in a lot of this development. So actually bring that front and center, so we have a sort of credible discussion of real end users like the ones that Kathleen sort of outlined. That's what we want to get to, and then find a solution that actually works for them.
So, I mean, more discussion can be good. In this case, I'm not entirely sure. We've talked about it, but like, discussion doesn't give them a solution. I think at the end of the day, what you're hoping is for ECH to not happen. And even if you were to be, in your view, successful here at like making the IETF not do that, even though, you know, we are, and we've had this discussion before, that won't help you. The technology exists. It's out there. There's open source software, and malware will not be limited by what we say in our nice ivory tower here at the IETF. So I would really strongly encourage this document to be dispatched as not looked for new work at the IETF. This has been discussed, as the people in the queue before me mentioned, and is only an attempt at making a technology that is happening, whether the IETF wants it or not, to just kind of delay it through IETF process. So I don't think this document is helpful.
Okay, thanks, David. As I said at the start, this is not about stopping the deployment of the VCH. It's about a more thoughtful way in how it's deployed, rather than, because you're right, you can't put it back in the box, but let's think about how to do it so that it doesn't surprise people, it doesn't catch them out, it doesn't weaken their security, which is what we risk currently. Thanks.
Thank you. It sounds like this discussion doesn't have any new elements, but perhaps we take it to a form that's not IETF then.
Okay, Eka?
Howdy, Eric Scroll Mozilla. So I'm also surprised to hear this characterized as new information. I don't think it is. Some of this discussion is 8744. It was discussed quite extensively. This is about the third document I've seen now with the sort of general content of people on path do a bunch of inspection and encrypting things interferes with them. I mean, this is more or less the content of 8404. 8404 actually has like a whole section on SNI. Nancy Camwingate had a document about this as well. This is sort of what indicators the compromise is about. So like this is like information which has been like extensively aired and discussed. Nevertheless, there's been strong consensus to proceed with this work, hence 8744. So I guess I'm not really sure what the new information is here. I think it's, there was some discussion about 8890. I think many of us perceive that we're acting in the interest of the users. So I think it's pretty hard to like, I don't think it's really fair to characterize this as the voice of the users has been absent and you're bringing in the voice of the users. The interest that this seems to represent to some extent is network operators as much as users who believe themselves to be acting in the interest of the users perhaps. This brings us I think to the main point, which is that the setting of concern here is the one where you have an on-path inspection element, which does not have effective control of the endpoint. If it had effective control of the endpoint, it wouldn't need to do local inspection, as Kathleen suggested. It could merely disable ECH or disable DNS separation GPS, either of which would allow it to inspect the main names that are going through. You mentioned that you thought people were not intending to allow disablement of ECH. I'm not sure who you've spoken to. We have not. We at least haven't firmed up our plans. But as I mentioned on the chat. In Firefox, ECH is tied to DOE, and DOE is easily disabled. And certainly is disabled when there's any evidence of effective enterprise management. So the correct approach in this case is for the enterprise or the network to attain control of the endpoint and have DOE and ECH disabled, and then they can continue to do the inspection they've been doing all along. And if you can't do that, then you're simply indistinguishable from any other on-path attacker, or sorry, from any on-path attacker. Which the purpose of like this exercise is precisely to prevent on-path attackers from inspecting the data. So again, like it's the control of the endpoint that distinguishes legitimate use from illegitimate use in this case. in terms of dispatch questions, a number of people said the correct place for this to go is the TLS. If there's a new text you think is appropriate to be in the security considerations of the ECH draft, then I would suggest you suggest it. I'm not sure what that text ought to be, but that place for that to happen is there.
Thanks, Eka. And just to clarify, I won't embarrass them here because that wouldn't be fair, but certain other large client software developers have indicated that they don't intend to allow ECH to be disabled in their deployment. So it seems like Mozilla's doing things in a different and arguably better way in that regard.
Well, as I said, we have not decided what we plan to do. I guess perhaps, I don't know which developer you're talking about. If it's Chrome, perhaps David could speak to it. If it's not Chrome, I guess it'd be helpful if you identified who it was.
Okay, thanks, Eka. Jonathan?
Jonathan Hoyland, Cloudflare. I'd like to know how you consider connection coalescing in the scope of this. So given that certificates are not visible on the wire with TLS 1.3, just doing SNI inspection doesn't give you the ability to block bad websites, quote unquote, because you may well find that they are coalesced to some other website. And unless you are going to advocate full terminate, reestablish for every outbound connection, which is obviously incredibly invasive, I think the ship has already sailed.
Thanks. Well, to be fair, there's existing content filtering software which does filter on SNI, which is fairly widely used from a variety of vendors. Maybe that's a discussion we can have offline in terms of some examples, if that's useful.
I just think that software also fails to account for connection coalescing, which is already deployed and already exists and is already used. So as even if you manage to kill ECH, you're not going to achieve the effect you want.
Okay, thank you. Daniel?
Hi there, Daniel Gilmore, ACLU. I just wanted to agree with previous speakers that this work probably does not belong at the IETF. I want to point out that I have actually done maintenance work in school environments where there are content filtering and malware and ransomware concerns. And yes, it is a burden, and the right way to do that is to do it on the endpoint. You're not going to block all malware. You're not going to block all ransomware with SNI detection. This is the wrong way to solve that problem, and we should not be breaking the other security goals that end users do have in order to try to half solve one of the other problems. The right way to solve ransomware is make sure you have good backups. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. I think it's fair to say you're probably not typical of the level of expertise in many schools, sadly. And also from a security point of view, removing a layer of security doesn't feel like a good sort of solution in that regard. Accepting it's by no means perfect, but no security is. But multi-layer, I think, is generally accepted as better than a single point of potential failure. But thanks. Thierry? Is Thierry there?
Hello.
Hi, that's it. Yeah, we can hear you now, Thierry.
Hey, can you hear me?
We can now.
Okay. Hey, Andrew, I was saying that one of the major challenges with malware today is, if you see, they are continuously updating their the way they use censorship technologies to avoid detection by passive network security services. And one of the challenges that I have seen is many of the malware families have started relying on the SNI. So for example, the SNI would say that, hey, I'm just visiting youtube.com, but in fact, it would be visiting malware.com. And that pretty much throws anyone who's assuming that they have a content filtering and they can just look at SNI and say that, hey, SNI is going to, let's say, youtube.com, and I'll just allow it. But in fact, it would end up going to a malware domain, right? So that's one big problem, that even without encrypted SNI, by just looking at SNI, you won't be able to detect malware and block it successfully. So this is probably for old malware families which are honest and giving you the right SNI, it would work, but the new malware families are not doing that. So even without encrypted SNI, this is a problem even today.
Okay, thanks, Teru. I think that's a call. The queue closed. So I guess we
Okay.
have
Yeah, I think we've reached the end of our queue here. Just kind of summing up from the chair point of view, it seems like the feedback here was pretty clear. There's no action for the IETF to take here at the moment. So thanks for walking us through it, Andrew. And I think we're on to our next topic.
Thank you.
Which would be trustworthy and transparent digital supply chains, SCITT. And Hank, will you be presenting? Great.
Hi, everybody. Is this fine? Okay, I'm Hank, as indicated. So yeah, I'm talking about trustworthy digital supply chain transparency services, which is a mouthful. So there's even more a mouthful of people on this slide. So I'm talking on behalf of multiple individuals, and we have and that's maybe something to highlight early on, an email list already. It's a non-working group email list on the IETF space. It's skid@ietf.org. And thanks to all of the people that already commented before we are starting this presentation here, because I think that's very useful. There are some trends about replies there already, but let's get into some of the context. I will be talking a lot of context first before I come back to the SCID stuff. And so, thank you. SCID is, of course, SC, it's supply chains. And generic supply chain, of course, it's obvious there are entities in there, and they have purpose and intent. So some of them are designing things. They give you a plan, an activity, and this goes into production at some point to create a commodity. And this commodity is then brought throughout the world because you supply things to other people. And at the end, there's a consumer. So that's very obvious, I think. So coming to the IETF scope, there's, of course, software. And software has a supply chain management component to it. And one very prominent one that everybody can look into. It's not the only one. It's by far not the only one, but it's very obvious. It's like GitHub. You have source, and you can look at the source, and the source will basically compose the things that you will, in the end, compile and build. And that's the second step here. So we have developers creating stories, and then you go at some point to a release, also temporal artifacts that are going to CI, the continuous integration, and then you create software artifacts. So all of this is very common. Again, you distribute them, you package them, and at the end, they end up on your computer. But also already here, what you do have is on the CI and the distribution level, some third-party endorsement that co-come in here. And you do some artifact that will never be published in the end. So you have things that you might want to know about because they will affect the quality of your product that will end up as your application. Next slide, please. Click. Do I have to click? Do you need a clicker?
It's remotely.
Oh, it's somewhere is doing it. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't know. So, so why do you want to know about the supply chain? You just care about the thing that is running on your computer, right? So I'm starting with the right here, and the right says, but sometimes I really want to know, right? I really want to know why this came to be, why this is happening, and later on in the slide deck, you find some executive order thing you might have heard about. And so the real question is, what's the provenance of the things that will end up in my trusted computing base? Trusted computing base means the things I can really believe in if it tells me stuff's happening. So there's a lot of red text in this now augmented supply chain example that is about software. Bear with me here with the software. And so you can, for example, poison the compiler. and that makes you create different different binaries, and then they're based on the same source, of course, yeah, but the tool chain now suddenly becomes relevant. So you want maybe have some insight on the tool chain, and you want to have some insight about the versioning that is in the end done. So if you're just fake at the end of versioning, it might look like the same thing. So it's healthy still, but it isn't. And so all these things are now not only about the binary that you create, it's not about only the artifacts are created, but it's about the metadata around the supply chain and the context. So that's dependencies, the gray arrow on top. Next slide, please. And all of this is not old. Sorry, it's new? No, this has been very old. So in 2016, I think that's the oldest quote here, all this happened before, right? So this is not a new problem. Everybody knows about these problems. Everybody has seen these problems before, and still they're happening. So that's why there's this famous executive order, because they're still happening today. And basically that's what all this slide is about. I could go on, but these are just references that basically say, this is not a solved problem, independent of any solution that is there today. And there are reasons for that. So next slide, please. Because this is a problem that's everywhere, and it's not solved in a generic way. So what I'm going here is fish, that's at the top, and chips, that's at the bottom. The cold chain of seafood is a supply chain, as well as the chips that you put into computers. So fish and chips are also things you want to talk about. This is not only about binary transparency, which is nice to talk about, but it's about the endorsements of all of these things. Has my fish exceed the temperature of 1 degree Celsius? Then the cold chain has been broken. Has something been, and then now picking again some red text out here off the bottom, has some, it's called insert Trojan circuitry. That's a very hot topic, I think. So you want some transparency into that. Well, there may be a falsification of test results. So this is actually bad, but hey, I'm telling you, it's good. And what's very on vogue right now is like on the very right, there we are in a circular economy today. Everything is circular. So is my recycling really real, or is fictitious? Right? There's so many attacks on these things, and this is just microchips. Again, there might be attacks on fish. You might see the result the next day if you eat the wrong fish, but it's not always as obvious when you have a malfunctioning microchip in your computer. So next slide, please. So coming back to the very first slide, all of this is about the auditing in the end. So you want the transparency, of course, serves a purpose, and the purpose is auditing. And now there's this EO, I have to read this, 14028, which is about increasing the nation's cybersecurity from Biden in the US. And there are a lot of things about artifacts here, which are then described via the softer bills of materials, and that's fine. So describing artifacts, statements about the supply chain artifact, that's cool. But this is not what this is about. So this is a very good use case. We really want to address that use case. There's a lot of sense to address that use case, but we also do the fish and chips and all the other things, right? So the transparency that this work is about is not just about software, which is like, can be like a SWIT and SPDX and Salsa and the Cyclone DX with the vulnerabilities, and then you have to mesh all that. You have to understand the statements that are now been transparent by the transparency service. But that's nice, but we're not about that statement level. We are one layer above. We are about the global interoperability of creating transparencies about all these statements. Next slide, please. So that's basically the core intuition. The transparency ledger basically makes you, that ensures that a malicious actor actually cannot contradict other people. That will be seen. A lie will be made non-repudiable. It's very obvious, I think, as a goal. And so the different actors on the supply chain can react on this inconsistency, actually. And also it's about that you provide the service and that you control, basically it's a transparent confidentiality. So you control what is confidential, what is transparent. The thing what we provide here is that it's interoperable, however you do it. If you just have one contractual partner, fine. If you want to show it to the world, fine. But the thing is, what the IETF building blocks are used here are for is transparency about the statement about the artifacts. So that all the consumers of the claims can basically say, I can vouch that they made this transparent. I can give you now a tiny thing, and we'll come to that. Of course, it's some IETF technology, the tiny thing back that tells that. And there are examples that transparency systems actually work. I'm not going into the details here right now, but there's previous work that shows, okay, that makes sense. And some of that is actually the certificate transparency, and some of it is the binary transparency, which are all very specific use cases of what it is. We are up-leveling this to a global level, then higher layer, so to speak. Next slide, please. So we have two things. If we're talking about the service maintains this append-only ledger. That's basically the thing that contains the thing you can't take back if you say it out loud, so to speak. And then if you say it out loud, if you put it to the service, you will get back a counter-signing thing. That's a receipt. And it's cryptographic proof that some identity has said this at a given point of time. And you don't have to actually understand what the statement means. It's really important that you can verify that it has been made and it was available at that time, that somebody did this. And that is an issue of responsibility, effectively. And the identities we involve here, you could think, sure, you're going with PKIX first, but we want to abstract that a little bit with the WebDIT from W3C, which basically is a URI pointing or identifying, sorry, to a specific identity document. So we want to have this little bit of the flexibility here, what kind of identity system you want to use. That's why the current proposal is to use DIT. And so the very important thing is the first statement, and maybe we go to the next slide. I guess there's an architecture picture. Yeah, exactly. So you have this artifact. It's a fish. It's the very top. They have a flow now from the top to the bottom. And the artifact is the thing you want to talk about. You create a statement about the artifact, and then you wrap it in an envelope. And now you can basically already see this is cozy. So we are talking to cozy and IETF building blocks here to sign by an issue of the statement. And there might be a little bit of unfortunate terminology, but for now we call this a claim. And this already includes the identity of the issuer. But the really important thing now is that you send this already signed thing that you're responsible for managing the key material to this transparency service that has a ledger. And back you get a counter signature about a ledger-based thing that is now again available to you. And now you can validate the signature of that receipt. And the important thing here is air gap. You can validate this fact. You have to have exposed this to the transparency service globally by a receipt that you can validate offline. And that's very useful. And sometimes you don't believe that, and then you go back to the transparency service at the right edge here, and go to the ledger and can do all the audit trails. You can find out, does it really make sense to me? So the auditors in the end have now two things to do. They can replay ledger service intern, or they can just look at the receipt that they collected. So both is viable in most cases. Sometimes you do one, sometimes you do the other, sometimes you do both. And so next slide, please. So this is about the cozy world. So this is the first step. You issue your statement. And there's some things in here, like they did at the top. There's something you know, like ELK and key ID, that might make a lot of sense. Then there's something called the feed. And this might be new work we want to talk about. So this is like the subject you're talking about. The feed is, and now we come back to the example of the SBOM, my version updates. So it's still the same thing. It's Thunderbird. I'm sorry, I'm not saying any names, but it's a software edit. My editor, my text editor, right? So, and now it gets a new version. So in these versions have a provenance and a history. That's a feed. I'm as an issuer using the same key to add onto that. So there's history. And at some point say, this is discontinued. And I put an end to this feed. But sometimes I just die as a company and I don't have the time for that, and that doesn't ever happen. So now you can really check by the transparency service, okay, there was a continuous update of this feed, but suddenly that stopped. Maybe that's a red flag for me. Maybe I shouldn't use that anymore. So feeds are the subjects we are talking about, and the rest is like a CTI you might be very, very firm of. Yeah, let's go to the next slide, I think. I think that's enough on this topic. And the append thing is now we have a ledger that's a hash tree. It's a Merkle tree. I think that's very obvious. It could be done distributed in the blockchain. We are doing this as a decentralized hash tree replica thing. And the important thing to ensure scalability here, you can not just only assert one statement, but a bundle of statements, and that creates a new hash root. So if you're familiar with the concept of Merkle trees, you can see there's already some optimization done here. The important thing is at the bottom again, I think, which is a new countersigning specification for COSI that would include a countersigning proof that an operation has happened with a bunch of statements potentially on the hash tree. And this is what you get back. So you send in the signed envelope, the signing envelope from COSI. What you get back is a counter signature, basically specifically tailored to the hash tree principles here. And that is the offline validatable receipt. That is one of the value adds I think the solution provides. Next slide, please. So you don't have to do this alone. So we are not expecting that you are adhering to one global ledger owned by, I don't know, Acme org, but you could do that. You can also have your own with your own contextual partner. And now there's a spectrum between those extremes, okay? And the spectrum is, I think, addressed by federation. So everything we built here, and that might be up to further discussion, is something we want to do in a federated system of transparency services. So the identities might have trust relationships. So the WebDIT comes in again, and how you correlate this. And I think, yeah, this is an open topic. I think it's a goal. It's on the roadmap, but that's certainly something we have to take into account because this should not be shipped in the night. This should be, again, that's why we are doing this on an interoperable level with the transparency with COSI and such, and the receipt mechanism here in the IETF. Next slide, please. So this is not just theoretical. There's running code, but this running code is very young. So please bear with me. So that's from the confidential consortium framework because it was already there and it adhered to like, let's say 75% of the requirements. So we made some running code that basically has the green bubbles here, like the primary, that's the primary ledger. We have replicas of it. And between them is running a consensus protocol. So if one of these things doesn't work, is differing from the others, you get even more guarantees. And that is where RATS kicks in, for example, right? So if every of these nodes operate as they should be, and they don't, they shouldn't be able to provide you with attestation results that they do the things they are supposed to do and nothing else, because, well, they didn't. So we want to add guarantees on the central level first. And because we know that people who create the original statement might not be in the position today to create RATS viable evidence, I don't know, when they catch a fish on a boat. I want to say this is in a cooling chain now. Maybe that is not RATS supported. So that is nothing we require today, but it's foreseeable feature. But what we can most definitely require today is that the central service, that is the cluster of transparency services, could be supported by, or is effectively supported by remote attestation technology as done by the IETF. And we have some examples here that this SCX protected items are running in the ledger stores. SCX is an example because of this running code. That's not restricted to it. It's just a first proof of concept. Let's think about this as more broader than this. Next slide, please. So yeah, the takeaway is this is basically only IETF technology what I'm talking about right now. We're signing things with COSI. The payload is opaque. Everybody can talk about interoperability of payload effectively, but that's not our concern here with this work. It's one layer above. The transparency has to be interoperable, otherwise how should you know? You cannot agree on everything. Fish temperature could be a picture of a spoiled fish. Okay, fine. You can't standardize that. You may be able to standardize most of the SBOM stuff, but that's also really hard if you follow the discussion out there, like the, I don't know, Cyclone X, SPDX, and why have to do a SWIT thing, right? So that's already a problem by itself, and that's only software. So if you look at the whole supply chain, it might be better just to focus on the transparency of that thing. And I think COSI is an excellent building block, and I'm not the only one. There was a list of names at the beginning here. And so to add on to this COSI issuer authenticity, if I want to say, the REDS output, I think, as attestation results defined today, would help there. And again, transparency services with certificate transparency and the ambiguous thing that is called binary transparency, there's a lot of meanings, has precedence. So there's one RFC, we are borrowing a lot of terms from that, but it's not that, okay? It's transparency, but on a higher level. So that's my take-home message for this Secdispatch thing, and I hope it is of interest to the IETF, because that's why I'm here. We want to have some guidance on how to proceed on this work. And so that's hopefully less than 20 minutes. I actually don't know. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I have a last slide. Sorry. Yeah, this is last edition. So if you're free after this session, we can gather outside. And just around the corner, there's a conference room. And we can continue discussion about this. We have a regular meeting on Tuesdays. It's by chance 5 p.m. on Tuesdays. So we made this a BOF, like a pre-BOF. It's not an actual BOF, it's a bar BOF. And I don't know. I heard sometimes people find beer at bar BOFs. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. I can't tell about this. But it's around the corner. If you want to meet, it's 5 p.m. At the coffee table. And if anybody is interested in joining in that and doesn't have lunch plans before 6 p.m. today, maybe just join the discussion. There's a link here. It's in the slides. Maybe someone so nice to copy that link into the Meet Echo chat. Then you can just join wherever you are, even if you're at dinner, for example. So I almost forgot about that. And yeah, so that's basically it. That's our proposal here, and I hope we find a place. And we can do a queue if you agree. I don't know.
Yep, we have a bit of a queue built up. I think Antoine is the first one to go.
Okay. Yes. So I just want to make some additions based on comments that were made in the chat during the presentation. So I think there were several comments about this having been discussed before, and why should IETF want to try to standardize this? No. So I think I should be quite clear that the main application from IETF point of view is transparency for binaries and software supply chain. So at this point, there are many actual deployed implementation of binary transparency systems made by Firefox, made by Google, made by Microsoft. And it's a bit concerning that there is currently no interoperability at all between these systems. And one of the reasons that we think that the kind of demand for implementations is going to increase very quickly is confidential computing, which is a use case where you have hardware that can provide remote measurement of binary that is running somewhere else, and you want to interpret the security of this binary. And essentially, the only way that you can make this useful is through transparency. And that's one of the big driving factors that justify having more interoperability for a large-scale transparency system that would work for complex software or even web service environments.
Thanks, Antoine. I'm next in the queue, so taking off chair hat, moving to participant hat. So this seems like clearly a big piece of work that I think I agree with the discussion in the chat that if there's an IETF problem here, we need to have a BOF to kind of validate that there's broad agreement on this and there's a community to solve it. I think I would probably suggest two broad areas of preparation for that BOF. One is kind of validating or kind of focusing in on a fairly specific problem where people can kind of understand a specific architecture, a specific interoperability problem in particular. And kind of focusing this up a bit from what is currently, as I understand, a very, very broad problem statement. The second thing I would suggest focusing on is kind of building up the community aspect, validating that there are other folks who are shipping real systems out there who want to solve this interoperability problem. So I think Antoine is correct that we have a bunch of systems out there these days that are not currently interoperable. But it's also not clear to me that that's a problem because a lot of these things are intra-vendor. Firefox's binary transparency is verified by Firefox, and so there's not a bunch of need for interoperability. So validating that there are people who are going to ship whatever product the IETF might come up with, is kind of the other suggestion I would make in terms of what we need to solve with BOF. And then I'll pass to Eric.
That makes a lot of sense. So just interjecting before Ecker, hi.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Before Ecker comes in, yeah. So yeah, the point is actually really, do people need that interoperability, or is it not necessary, right? So that is, I think, a thing that we really have to come to a conclusion with, because if nobody needs an interoperable way to find out if the supply chain statements are true, then this is not necessary, right? So yeah, Ecker, sorry, you got it.
No, please. So I think first, like, I think the not buried lead, like, yeah, this is gonna need a BOF if anything. So the higher order question for me is like, what the relevant community is and how much of it we're seeing. So Antoine mentioned that there's like, been a lot of different BT efforts, and I'm flattered that people are acting as if the Firefox one is perhaps a little more alive than it really is. And they are interoperable. It's not clear to me making another one is going to solve that problem. So I guess my question is, are those people going to come and do they want to standardize and make an interoperable standard? I know there's similar work, in what's often called Web3, and so are those people coming and want to work on this? So I think, like, before IETF does an effort, right, we should make sure that, like, we're getting enough of the relevant community that we're actually creating a converged standard rather than we're just creating our own standard that those people will then ignore. So I think that would be the thing that I think is absolutely most critical for the BOF to get into. I think the second would be, what is the minimal viable thing that can be done here, rather than the sort of maximalist vision you're proposing? The maximalist visions are good, but in terms of making progress, making minimum viable is valuable. And so DKG hand waved a little bit of direction. I think that's valuable. For my hand waving, I guess I would say that I think that the ledger aspect of this has perhaps been oversold in many cases. We got pretty far with CT with basically no meaningful third-party verifiability. And so to the extent to which that is like not that big a deal, then okay. But to which that's a big part of the value prop. Counter signatures will get you pretty far. So and certainly for most of the cases, like we looking for BT, like if you just had counter signatures, you'd actually be like get most of the way there. So I think anything we can do to slim the problem down would be valuable.
Yeah. Getting the people in the right room, the right people in the room, and also show that there is a minimum viable solution that people can agree on is, of course, part of the BOF process. And I think it's Adrian. I don't know.
Hey.
Masks.
Yeah, Stephen Farrell. So yeah, I think Richard and Ecker said mostly what I wanted to say is that a BOF seems like the right dispatch if there's if you can get a bunch of people interested in the topic. I think it's a good topic. In addition to kind of trying to come up with a minimal piece of work that focuses on interoperability for the IETF part, it's also a giant topic. So I'd say try and also find a small bit.
Box it, yes.
Yeah, and yeah. So I think there could be a possible BOF here if you get more people involved, and there is such a small chunk. Because otherwise, I think the BOF would be just kind of likely to waste a whole bunch of time only discussing scoping, and maybe never coming to conclusion.
Yeah, we don't want to meander again and again about the same binary transparency thing that has been, I would agree with that. And the next in line, maybe I'm talking. Who is?
I think I'm up next, Dave Taylor. I'll be real short because I had a number of points to make, and Richard made all of them. But since he asked those who are arguing for a BOF to say what the BOF should accomplish, I just wanted to weigh in that said I agree. I think some of the main points is to make sure that that there is a need for interoperability, that there would actually be multiple implementations that are actually interested in implementing the same thing as opposed to proprietary stuff, and also that the sets of people that represent implementations of those would actually be coming to IETF. In other words, are the right set of people in the room, and would they actually want to implement stuff? Because we've had other cases of interesting problems to be solved, and I can think of cases where there wasn't agreement that we needed interoperability, and in another case, there wasn't an agreement that the IETF actually had the people coming coming to it to do it. And so I think the point of the BOF is to actually establish that those things are true. So thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, yes. It's an interesting problem. I support having a BOF. However, I think that of this whole chain, the amount that is actually relevant to IETF is fairly small. The reason that I think it would be valuable for the IETF to have a BOF is that this is a chain, and at the moment we don't have people in all the parts of that chain talking to in one place and working out where to send each of the work items. So, for example, I was involved in code signing back in the 1990s. That technology works, but hasn't moved on from there. We still sign the software distribution. We do not sign the code that actually runs on the machine in a standardized way. We could move to do that. We could standardize all that part, but you would need to have the Microsoft, Apple, Google, the Linux community involved in the room to do profitable work on that side. At the other end, if you want to do work on the development part of the cycle, you need Git. Now, I know that you have a Microsoft research person, so GitHub would be, I would, if you're going to have a BOF, I would say get GitHub to bring the Git people into the room, because they have technology that is very close to being where we need it to be. The problem is signing your commit doesn't do quite enough. And finally, and I'm absolutely serious here, if you want to get anything anywhere, do not mention Web3, do not mention blockchain, and absolutely do not mention proof of work. Mentioning
I said ledger, but I think that's maybe neutral enough. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like, pretty soon that technology is going to be like, say you've got leprosy. We need to go to Harvester.net or blockchain. So I think that there might be some useful work we can do in IETF on the identity part and on that chain part, but we've got to be pretty careful.
Yeah, I think this has to be carefully worded. Also, what you just said was the initial box that we were talking about. It would be a little bit bigger when we talk about the running codes signing. But well, that's delving into the, I don't know, for example, confidential computing space. It would have a strong overlap. That's not bad. But maybe that's a second step. So maybe we have to really find out what the initial box is, and then go from there to what you just said. So I think that the path is right. So, but I think we have to carefully compartmentalize the problem so that people don't get scared away, like you're trying again to boil this here, right? This will never work. This is like code signing over again. So, yeah.
But code signing did work. It's deployed technology. It just doesn't do quite enough.
Exactly.
And it isn't tied.
Exactly. Yeah. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. Daniel.
Hi there, Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. I find this kind of work interesting, but I think a BOF is the right place to go. And I would specifically ask for the BOF to think about what actionable outcomes there are for whatever systems you're trying to design, right? If all of this is, I just want to know where my code comes from, I just want to see this transparency stuff, but there's no concrete actions that can result, then we've built a lot of mechanism that doesn't actually do anything, right? And I worry about this in a lot of different contexts, not just technical ones, but transparency without accountability doesn't actually get you as far as you'd like it to be, right? We think of transparency as a step towards management. So as you're thinking about what are the interoperable goals here, think about the interoperable actions that can be taken not just in the positive case where, okay, everything is on the chain, we're fine, but what are the actions where you don't want to run something because it didn't match this, and how can you actually get to that point? I think that's often missing. The folks who you want in the room here are going to include people from the reproducible builds community. I mentioned that in the chat. That's reproducible-builds.org. They've been doing this kind of work, but from the inside out, whereas I think what you're trying to design here is something from the outside in. The folks who have been doing that in different contexts will have a lot of insight about what the stuff actually on, close to the machinery looks like, and what you can get to. So, thanks.
Thanks. I think that's a valuable and very true statement. Thank you. It's you.
David Skenazy, Google. Sorry, I didn't get up. DKG was in the queue before me, but he seemed to have disappeared. So first off, thanks for this presentation. This is the first time I'm thinking about software signatures and then wanting fish and chips for dinner. This was great. But then as the presentation went on, you did give me like a pretty serious spike in anxiety. This problem is very big to the point where it makes my head spin. And so kind of coming back to like the dispatch questions and where we go from here, I think the first dispatch step is a bar-off, which is really great that you're doing that, because a lot of good IETF work starts that way. And so this, is early, that's where I would start. So absolutely, that's great. And, if you have beer, even better. And then next steps. So I think you definitely need to figure out a way that you can present this without my head spinning. I'm sure I'm not the only one. And so teasing out, like from what other folks have said, which part really belong in the IETF and which part don't. So I think there's value in explaining kind of the overall ecosystem, and then so people know the context, but really focusing on like what parts we need. I wouldn't spend any time on like the solution yet, like Cose or whatever, like things you have, like that will come later, but really saying, okay, these are the bits that we need to do here. And what I would suggest for you is to spend the bar-off meeting the people who are interested and figuring what those bits are with them, and then kind of bringing that back at a future meeting or on the list to perhaps hope for a BOF. I think this is a good direction to go in, but the scope is really, really big right now. And I've never seen a IETF effort with such a huge scope succeed, but if you manage to scope it down to something, you can actually make progress.
So thank you, David. So the two pieces that we currently think are in the box are just the issue thing and the receipt thing. All of the framing, how is this useful? Who doesn't really need that? I think, yes, that should be a growing topic, and I hope to have some discussion today, basically soon. And yes, we will definitely make this happen so that we can have in a 4-month interval an actual BOF maybe, and we'll discuss the results of this intermediate discussion. Cool.
Great. So I think I'm last in queue, and so I do support this work as well. I would like to see that we're not just considering scale for those signing code and for building supply chain, but for those using it later as well. So we don't wind up with a solution that is just really not manageable for organizations and requires just tons of resources and the architectural patterns for management that we've created all along. So that's something that I will be looking out for. And so consensus seems to be the recommendation for this to go to a BOF if the ADs agree. There's a lot of interest, and I think the eyes the IETF could put on it would be really helpful.
Yeah, that is the point.
Yeah.
The eyes of the
others.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. So I can't look at you at the same time. Somewhat it's confusing. So Kathleen, thank you. So the eyes of the IETF should help us shape that box, as David just said. And I think we have two pieces, and they might already be very specific.
I think they're viable, but still, again, this will be a process. Thank you. I think that is a nice response from the group here. And yeah, again, at 5 p.m. out of this door, basically, let's meet up and go around the corner and have a first chat about boxing and what is outside the box and who thinks inside the box. Thank you.
All right, so I think that was our last talk, and I believe Richard has the summary ready to go. And so I'll turn over, or do you want me to run through the summary? If you want to just wire it to me, I'll read it out.
Well, did we have key consistency, folks? Chris, what were you
No,
gonna say
we're
about
not
it?
gonna, it was removed
Okay,
from the
we got
agenda.
that. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I could talk about review our findings here. So just going through the topics we have covered today. Talked about updating parameters for syslog. That got dispatched to UTA. Second thing was updating the IANA SSH parameters registries. Feedback was to move that to 80 sponsorship, and Roman agreed to sponsor that, or work with the Sec 80s to figure out who to sponsor it. Third thing was Andrew's talked about ECH deployment considerations. Resolved to take no action on that. And finally, on the trustworthy supply chain thing, the feedback was to take that to a BOF, and I think there was some good feedback in the discussion for how the proponents should kind of work to refine this and kind of set themselves up for a successful BOF on that. So I think that's the findings I have. Thank you to everyone for the presentations and for the good discussion there. With that, I think we're on to any other business. Hearing none, I believe we are then adjourned. Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Sorry?
How do you make a great text block headline? I couldn't figure out how.
The great text block.
Are you seeing it side by side?
No, you can look at my screen here. I'll turn around. I was editing. I'm not sure what you mean.
So if you go to side by side, for example, you'll see that this ended up in a gray text block, but I don't know how you started those.
I'm assuming it's because there's an empty line, or that there's a tab. Although I tried to start all the people under an item with a tab. So
right. I couldn't figure out how to